Hello, everybody. My name is Matthew Peterson. I am a PGY3 at the University of Florida. This is my senior talk. We'll be talking about training for a 5K, 10K, half marathon, a marathon. Basically, pick your distance. A lot of this stuff will be applicable across all those distances. We will be kind of going into a bit of strategy about the training and some basically physiological background to the different types of training if you want to either run your first or get faster at your distance running. The objectives for today, we will review the exercise physiology that's applicable to aerobic training, discuss some workouts to improve areas of importance when training, such as the VO2 max or the lactate threshold. We're going to delve into the concept of periodization and why that is beneficial, and also review some sample training schedules. So this all comes from a place near and dear to my heart. I was a runner for a long time, back when I knew a lot about running and nothing about medicine. This was my life. Competed in high school, college, as well as a little bit post-collegiately as kind of like a semi-pro. But in my master's at Long Beach in California, I did a master's in exercise physiology. So that was where I was able to actually kind of learn a lot about the background of something that I love to do. So to cover some definitions that we need to kind of establish up front, when we talk about training specifically, there's different ways that you could organize and describe training. There's the mode, which is what type you're doing, such as are you biking, are you running, are you doing a bench press, are you doing a squat, are you swimming, are you hiking, are you skiing? Basically, like what the action is the mode. We can talk about the intensity, which can be rated in a lot of different ways, but generally I consider it like what percentage of your maximum effort are you doing this activity at? The volume, which is the total amount of work that you're doing, either how many reps you're doing or how long you're running or exercising for, or how many miles you're doing, basically describing the duration. And then there's the structure, which is how you organize the previous three. And you can vary a lot of these to get different benefits, and some are definitely more advantageous in terms of the organization than others. So to start, getting started, pick a date, decide what you want to do. Let's say you want to run a half marathon. You describe when you want to do it, pick a date, put it on your calendar. Where do you want to do it? What type of run? Is it a fun run? Is it like a mountain run? Basically, pick what you want to do, when you want to do it, where you want to do it at. And then we need kind of like some bare basics, like what gear do you need? And then what type of training plan do you actually want to do? Generally, I would recommend at least 3 months away from your race or your event to actually start planning some of this stuff and actually getting some training under your belt. So what do you need? I think pretty much if you want to actually take the running seriously and train for these, you definitely need a watch. You don't need like the fancy GPS watches, but you need a watch with a start and stop timer. If you're running at the time that I do, which is usually before work, it's usually dark, and us as residents don't have a lot of time to run after, or we're just exhausted after work. So I would recommend a headlamp. I think appropriate running clothing. I would recommend running shorts with an actual interior lining. Makes a huge difference. I personally think the shorter the better. 2-inch inseam's the way to go. For women, definitely an appropriate sports bra goes a long way. Some people might actually need to be appropriately fitted for these, but I've been told that a good fitting sports bra is a total game changer. And then shoes. There's a lot of debate within the footwear kind of industry about what's best, what do you need, all this stuff. I would recommend actually getting fitted for your first pair of running shoes if you've never have before. There's different stores, local stores. There's one within Gainesville. I think it's called the Gainesville Walking and Running Company. That will actually look at how you run, look at your feet, get you an appropriate training shoe for you. Don't always go by the cheapest. Don't always go by the next new and fancy thing either. I think you actually need someone to look at your feet and evaluate kind of what shoe would work best. So all of the training is built off of Hans Selye's general stress response principle. The very kind of basics of this is broken down that if you have some sort of stressor to your system, it could be any kind of physical stressor. It could be, a 10-mile run. It could be a weight session, like bench, bench pressing. Basically, whatever kind of stressor, you're going to have an alarm response. So basically, you in the short term, tire out. And so you actually stress response gets lower. And then eventually you have built up of resistance. So you get a little bit kind of better at doing whatever activity that is. However, if you continue to stress the system, eventually you'll have either adaptation or exhaustion. And the difference between those two is the type of training that you do. So if you go out and, for example, kind of crazy, but if you go out and just from the get-go, you're on 10 miles a day every day, you're going to eventually, have this alarm where you feel really tired in like the first 2 days. You'll build some resistance where you eventually kind of start getting some adaptation, feeling better. But if you don't appropriately schedule your training with recovery days, you actually end up going to an exhaustion phase where your performance will get worse. If you have appropriate training and allow time for recovery and structure your training in a way that's advantageous, you could actually see further adaptation, which is that red line there, and where you will continue to improve basically your, in this case, aerobic capacity. So when we talk about running or any kind of like endurance sport, we talk about the different energy systems that our body use. There's three main ones. There's the very kind of acute phase, like what is my energy that I need for about 10 seconds of high intensity exercise? That's the phosphagen system. This is used basically for max efforts, very short. There's a creatine phosphate in your body, which is broken down and releasing that phosphate that you could use for ATP. The amount in your body really only lasts about 8 to 10 seconds before you need to rest and reaccumulate it. So again, this is used high intensity, very short duration. The anaerobic system is kind of this in-between system. This is usually using, again, ATP as your energy source, but it's usually available only through glycolysis. Again, we're not using oxygen, it's anaerobic. So we don't move on to something like the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, which we'll get into, but you're basically using ATP that's readily available through glucose stores as well as your phosphate system. This usually only lasts about 1 to 2 minutes. You can think about something like a 400 meter or an 800 meter runner max effort for about 2 minutes before you really start to kind of deplete your anaerobic system. Beyond that, we're looking at the aerobic system. This theoretically could go indefinitely, and you really are utilizing oxygen in this case to get the most out of either your glucose and glycogen stores or your fat stores, because that could be broken down into energy and ATP looking at the long term. So these are the three different types of systems that we'll be using whenever we do physical activity. We will be focusing mostly on the aerobic system. This is going to be used for anything probably like a mile and up in terms of really where you want to focus your training. So when we talk about muscles that we use, there's different muscle fibers that are more beneficial at different types of exercise. So when we talk about these, type 1 muscle fibers is generally going to be better at doing that aerobic work. The reason because of this is that they have high mitochondrial content to actually do the conversion of your glucose into high amounts of ATP. There's type 2A and type 2X fibers that are used more for middle distance or like kind of that anaerobic work. And then the type 2X is going to be the ones that you'll mostly use for that high intensity. So we see some people are very naturally gifted with one muscle type versus the other. If you look at somebody like the Mountain over here from Game of Thrones, he's going to have a lot of type 2X fibers. He could train as much as he wants in terms of aerobic fitness. He just won't be able to naturally do the things that type 1 muscle fiber athletes will be able to do, and vice versa, right? This guy in here in the middle is Ryan Hall. He was gifted with a lot of type 1. This guy obviously trains probably as much, if not more, than the other guy, but he's training his different muscle fiber types very differently. And you'll see this if you look at the strongman competitions, they all kind of look the same. Lots of large muscle mass, type 2, and usually 2X muscle fibers. If you look at the end of the 10K at the World Championships for track, for example, like all of these guys will be looking pretty much similar, pretty skinny, and all of this is because they are predominantly type 1 muscle fiber type. So you see with training, particularly with aerobic training, you actually can change some of your muscle fibers within your body. So this study looked at biopsies of people who trained for 12 weeks. And what they found is that 12 weeks with high intensity HIIT training focused on aerobic work. So they found that after 12 weeks of training, they saw two main differences. One is that they actually shifted more from type 2X to type 2A muscle fiber type. So they shifted away from that kind of high intensity, short duration, large muscle mass type of muscle fiber to one that's kind of more intermediate. And they also found that they had increased mitochondrial density, nuclear density within the type 1 muscle fiber types. And so this is proposed that with more myonuclei, you're actually doing more metabolic activity within that muscle fiber. So they saw that this increased in the type 1 muscle fiber type, not the type 2. So now we're left with, going all the way back to biochemistry, our energy system. So we talked about a few of these, and I just kind of want to very briefly go over these to address that this is actually what we're doing when we train. So in the upper left-hand corner here, we have a creatine phosphate system. This basically is taking your available creatine phosphate, breaking it down into the release of the individual phosphate to use for ATP. Again, very short acting, takes a long time to replete, and only supplies energy for about 10 seconds. We have in the upper right-hand corner glycolysis. This is, again, an anaerobic process, does not require oxygen to do this. It breaks down available free glucose into ATP and NADH. NADH we'll come back to later, but basically this system gets your ATP in a relatively fast way. But again, we end up depleting our available free glucose stores pretty quickly. So this is a small amount of ATP that we could use for a relatively short amount of time, generally about up to 2 minutes. If we have access to oxygen and we move forward, we could access our citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle, as well as our electron transport chain. So we're using the pyruvate to go into the citric acid cycle to make more NADH and NADP and NADH. These are electron carriers that will be able to be moved to the electron transport chain, where we get most of our bang for our buck. And that's where you need the oxygen to come into play. So in the lower right-hand corner, you see the electron carriers dropping off electrons in the electron transport chain, which shuttle hydrogen from the intracellular space to the intermembrane space of the mitochondria that then can be used with ATP synthase to combine ADP with oxygen to ATP making making ATP, and that's going to be our main powerhouse in terms of where we get our energy to do any kind of metabolic work. So really, at the end of the day, you could get some ATP from our anaerobic systems, but in order to get a lot of ATP to do a lot of metabolic activity, you need oxygen. So that's where we're going to focus most of our training, is in aerobic type training. So really, this is just kind of to touch on that. We all know mitochondria is, quote, the powerhouse of the cell. That's where all of this ATP production comes into play. And if you remember anything from high school biology, is probably mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. And that holds true even today. So really, it's kind of what are we focusing on in terms of aerobic activity? And again, I don't want to delve too much into the biochemistry of this, but these studies show that with aerobic training of 8 weeks, they were basically able to see increase in all of the enzymes involved in the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain. So they were able to look at enzyme activity and enzyme concentration in all of these different muscles when they did muscle biopsies. And they saw with 8 weeks of aerobic training, they were able to increase the amount of these enzymes, basically saying that our mitochondria are becoming more efficient at doing what they do. This is another study showing much the same thing, but in this case, actually, we moved away from doing lactate accumulation, which you see actually at the end of the Cori cycle, and anaerobic work with just glycolysis. And this was showing that actually, if you train for those 8 weeks and get better at your aerobic capacity, you actually decrease your dependency on lactate and the Cori cycle in order to produce your ATP. Okay, so moving away from the biochemistry, we're going to talk about the 3 main focuses of aerobic training. One is increasing your VO2 max. So the VO2 max is defined by the heart rate times the AVO2 difference in the blood. Basically, the way I break this down is how much oxygen are you able to deliver and utilize by your body's systems. So that's one way. The lactate threshold is another way. We'll touch on that in a little bit more detail later. But basically, this is increasing the duration or the pace at which your body basically can operate in aerobic capacity. Because once you cross over into anaerobic work, you start building up that lactate. We all kind of know that feeling of getting, quote, lactic, where you get that heavy burning feeling in your muscles. This type of training is designed at moving that level or that level of lactate accumulation as far back as possible, so you could operate at a higher intensity for longer duration before accumulating lactate and going into anaerobic work. And then the last but not least is running economy. This basically looks at how efficient of a runner that you are. And basically, do you get more bang for your buck in terms of your utilization of ATP? So if we focus on VO2 max, this is designed, again, at increasing the total amount of oxygen that our body could utilize to work. So this is looking at high intensity, short duration repeats, doing them over and over again with medium amounts of rest. So an example of this would be HIIT training. So there's lots of different ways that you could do HIIT training. You could do it with miles, you could do it with, half miles, you could do different breakdown in terms of, I'm going to go minute on, minute off. There's lots of different ways to do this. But if you look at high intensity interval training, this really kind of gets you better at VO2 max. Some examples of this would be, 3 to 5 by 1 mile at, quote, your race pace with 3 minutes recovery. So it's like a moderate recovery. You're doing it at relatively fast, which would be race pace. And this could be something like your 5K or 10K, race pace. You could do also by minutes. You could go 10 times 1 minute on and 1 minute off. That way you have this repeated kind of high intensity with some rest, so that you can actually complete the workout, but still get a relatively high amount of time at that high intensity race pace. Another one that I like is to do what I call a ladder. So you go 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minute, 4 minute, 5 minute, 4 minute, 3 minute, 2 minute, 1 minute on with equal recovery. So every time that you do a high intensity interval, you do the equal amount of rest. That's a pretty hard workout, but it's one that I really like to do. So again, 2, how to get fast. We look at a lactate threshold, and this, again, these activities are designed at pushing back the amount of anaerobic work and increasing your capability to stay in the aerobic type of work. So if we look at a lactate threshold again, you could operate in low intensity and be in aerobic work for a long, long time. But as you increase in terms of your exercise intensity, you move kind of more away from aerobic work and into anaerobic work. And we know that with anaerobic work, we can't operate in that system for very long. So this is designed to move this curve to the right so that we could increase our exercise intensity, but stay in our low lactate levels and stay in aerobic exercise work. So this is really looking at, this is the Cori cycle, and this is looking at kind of the recycling of lactate. And again, as you can see, if we look at the gluconeogenesis process and the glycolysis process of the Cori cycle, you do get ATP, so you can use lactate as an energy system, but this isn't necessarily the most efficient in the fact that it doesn't utilize oxygen, so therefore you could only get so much ATP. And again, this lactate building up in your body's systems comes with some hydrogen ions as well, is not very comfortable for our as we do the work. And so generally, this is not very tolerated for very long. So these type of workouts are designed at medium to high intensity workouts. They are generally of longer duration. You do less intervals, but more total volume. So these intervals will be longer in time, but you might do less of them, only maybe like 2 or 3. And they are designed at short rest. So examples of these workouts would be, 10 minutes on with 2 minutes recovery, and you could repeat this 2 to 3 times. And this on time would be something that you think you could run for maybe like a 10K pace, maybe even like a half marathon pace. So it's a little less intense, but it's of longer duration. You could do it with miles, so 2 to 3 by 2 miles with 2 minutes recovery, or you could do what I call like a progression run. So you're going to run for 30 minutes, starting at something like a 10K pace. And eventually by the end of the 30 minutes, you're running faster. So the idea is to get faster throughout the 30 minutes of your running so that you could really, at the end of it, be moving pretty quick, pretty fast. Last but not least, we want to do workouts that focus on running economy. This is looking at the efficiency of how you run. There's lots of different ways to do this. There's some weight training, there's some drills, such as this guy on the left doing some running drills. There's also technology in terms of running shoes that really increase the efficiency of your running. This shoe on the right is the Nike 4%. Basically, this shoe is shown to increase your running mechanics and efficiency and energy utilization by adding 4%, which if you look at, over a marathon, that's several minutes, and that's the difference of making the Olympics and winning a medal versus like being an amateur runner. So this shoe is touted to be the next great breakthrough. If you look at the marathon runners nowadays, they're all wearing this. Who knows what contribution technology will make in terms of running mechanics, but if everybody's wearing the same shoe, it should be fair. Arguments one way versus the other about whether or not this is actually like a fair thing to do. But either way, kind of interesting in terms of the changes in the field in the last few years. Another thing that increases your running economy is doing the long run. I think this is an important of any training, whether or not you're running for a 5K or for a marathon. But the long run is really designed over 90 minutes. You start to get some adaptation in your musculature, like looking at your fascia and looking at your tendons and your ligaments and really building their strength and getting kind of more efficiency in terms of energy return in terms of the non-muscle parts of your running. And so I think incorporating the long run is really important. It also, if you do it appropriately, decreases your risk of injury as long as you're not going, super hard during the long run. Next, we come to the idea of periodization. This is where we're going to vary our intensity, our volume, and the recovery to maximize our benefit. For example, if you go out and you run the same thing every day, 6 days a week with 1 day off, you're probably not going to get much better. It's because you're not varying your training. You have to vary your training in both the volume and the intensity to see kind of the most bang for your buck. So for an example, we're going to look at some example trainings. I want you to kind of focus on how it's varied throughout the week. Again, we're not doing the same thing every day. We're introducing different exercises, different workouts with different goals in order to get kind of, at the end of the day, overall much faster. So if I was training for a 10K, I would do something like Monday, focus on a workout that's focused on a lactate threshold. So I would do something like that 30-minute tempo run that we talked about. On Tuesday, I'm doing an easy run, kind of focus more on recovery, focus on stretching and core. Wednesday, maybe another easy run, but perhaps maybe a little bit longer. Thursday, I would focus on VO2 max, so my high intensity interval training, something like 3 to 4 by 1 mile at a fast pace, like my 10K pace. For Friday, again, recovery day, Saturday, long run, Sunday, recovery day. So I'm varying both the intensity, the durations, and the focus of my workouts throughout the week. Same thing applies if you go longer distances. So if I'm doing a marathon, I'm doing similar training. I'm doing lactate threshold training. I'm doing VO2 max training. I'm doing long run. But as you can see, the durations are longer because we have to get used to that longer distance. But the idea is pretty much the same, varying the type of workouts that you do, varying the focus of those workouts, varying your recovery and your exercise. If you're just starting out, you might not be able to do those same type of workouts as a marathon runner, but the idea still holds, right? You still want to do something throughout the week that challenges your lactate threshold system and your VO2 max system and your efficiency system. So you still have the lactate threshold workout, you still have your VO2 max workout and your long run varied throughout the week. And so how do we periodize across a training cycle? So really you want to look at, we change the type of workouts that we do within the week as we saw in our previous training examples, but we can also change the volume and the intensity week to week, month to month, season to season to really see, kind of exponential training benefit. So what you'll see is kind of throughout the season, generally at the beginning, you increase the volume. After that, after you get more comfortable with your volume of training, you can increase the intensity. And then as you get closer and closer to the actual race day, you could see something like dropping the volume and increasing the intensity so that on race day, you're in terms of, muscle energy, at your peak because you've done less volume. So you're less depleted in terms of the total amount of work you've done, but you've increased your intensity. So your body is used to that type of, intense training. We call this peaking. And so if you have a good coach and you're able to do this, you change your intensity and volume throughout the training season so that you could peak at the right time. Also, your training is going to get more beneficial if you have, for example, 3 weeks of relatively hard work followed by a week that's quote an off week where you, down here in week 4, this was an off week where they both dropped the intensity and the volume so that their body was able to recover and get back to that higher training load better the next time. just a note on recovery. Recovery is really important. This could be a whole talk kind of in and of itself. It really comes down to, do you stretch? Do you eat well? Do you, do ice baths? Do you foam roll? Do you do massage? Do you have like good nutrition pre and post your exercise? Again, that's a whole kind of another talk to this. But again, I cannot stress the importance of recovery in terms of your training. Just kind of a side note, when we talk about peaking, I do want to touch on carbo loading. There's many different ways to do it. It's been shown to not really be beneficial in anything under kind of really a half marathon to a marathon distance. Most marathoners will do some carbo loading. The idea behind this is that you want to have the majority of your dietary intake in terms of calories be carbohydrates about the week leading up to a race. And we're talking like, 60 to 80% of your total calories coming into your body will be complex carbohydrates. And the reason for this is because over the course of like a marathon, you're actually using glycogen, which is the molecule shown here. Glycogen is basically strings of glucose. And if you get really good at utilizing your aerobic system, you'll be using glucose and fats mostly. And so if you have increased stores of glycogen within your muscles, you basically have all of the energy you'll need for the entire race stored within the muscles themselves. Very quick access in terms of your body's energy system in order to access, hopefully endless store of glucose. And that's why they do carbo loading. And it has been shown to be beneficial in terms of increasing the amount of glycogen within muscles. However, not a whole lot of really good studies have expanded that in actual performance, but the theory, I think, is strong. So now you're ready for race day. You've done your training. You've picked your date. You've given yourself appropriate amount of time. You know what you're going to focus on. You're going to focus on VO2 max workouts, which is like HIIT training, high intensity interval training. You're going to focus on lactate threshold workouts, which is long duration, moderate intensity, and then you're going to do long runs and recoveries and stretching. That's going to increase your efficiency. All of this built towards race day. And if you periodize your training right, meaning that you're organizing your structure of training to have a bit of a mix of all of them, including recovery days, you'll be well on your way to performing well. Here's my works cited. Thank you. Unfortunately, I'm not there to answer questions, but I just want to thank everybody within the program. It's been an amazing 3 years. And if anybody has any questions about running, feel free to ask. Send me a text, send me an email, kind of whenever.